Welcome to this podcast from the International Organization for Migration's Regional Data Hub in Nairobi, Kenya. Today, we are marking the launch of a new research report titled Navigating Climate, Conflict and Migration, Insights from Ethiopia and the East and Horn of Africa. That was produced in partnership with CGIAR and is based on data collection by IOM across the Horn of Africa. This is an important time to discuss the intersection of climate change, human security, and mobility. A call to action for Africa's climate mobility was issued by the African Union. The COP30 Special Envoy for Africa and IOM pushing for the integration of human mobility into climate financing and into national adaptation plans while strengthening solidarity on a just climate transition. With this in mind, we are excited to delve into the findings of this new report to better understand how climate variability and insecurity converge to drive mobility decisions in Ethiopia and across the East and Horn of Africa regions, and what can be done to address this. I am your host, Kenza Aggad, and I am joined today by two distinguished experts who are at the forefront of this research. With us today is Victor Villa, an economist at CGIAR Climate Security Team and lead author of the report, as well as Sabira Coelho, the regional thematic specialist at IOM's regional office in Nairobi. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you both for taking the time to speak with us about this pressing topic.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to IOM for this very interesting opportunity that we had during this collaboration. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to present a bit this product that was co-developed between the Regional Data Hub and CGIAR Focus Climate Security Team, and I'm looking forward to discuss more about this.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you. So, Victor, the report puts a spotlight on Ethiopia and the East and Horn of Africa. Could you explain why this region is so critical for understanding the climate migration nexus?
For sure. And thank you very much for this very interesting question. So I would start saying that when we first started this collaboration together with the Regional Data Hub, we really noticed that there was a gap. Most studies were focusing on migration route outside this region, mainly towards Europe, Gulf states. But to really understand how climate impact mobility, this region is really key. So we decided to focus on the East Horn of Africa in broader terms, basically following all the countries that have been covered by the Regional Data Hub here in Nairobi. In this region, mobility is really part of life. For years, people have moved seasonally to access water, pasture, work, even across borders. And now these mobility dynamics are really put under pressure from increasing climate stress. To give you an example, but you sure already know about this. So between 2020 and 2023, this region experienced 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons. And this was really captured in the data. These failed rainfall seasons really led to severe drought impacts. Issues such as severe food insecurity, reduced access to water, and massive livestock losses. Within this picture, Ethiopia really sits at the center of this crisis, both geographically and demographically. In our dataset, to give you some number, more than 80% of the individuals departed from this country, compared to all these other regional scenario. So also Ethiopia's economy is really dependent on rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism. So when rain fails, it really hits people's life, making at risk millions of people. In short, I can say that this region really shows how climate stress and people's livelihood intersect. Also shaping how, why, and when people move. Thank you.
Very, very interesting, Victor. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. So the report highlights climate security hotspots. What does this term mean in practice, and why are these areas so significant?
Fantastic. Thank you very much again. And actually, you touch a very central point of this report, because we introduced an analysis that is so-called climate security hotspot. As I mentioned before, climate is really affecting people's life in this region. And when droughts hit or flood hits, they can destroy crops, kill animals, and reduce water and pasture access. And over time, this building pressure can exacerbate existing tensions, or also lead to conflict over access to scarce resources. However, I would say that linking these two components, climate stress and conflict, is quite challenging, especially from an empirical point of view. So to help us visualize this pattern, we decided to map those geographically, these so-called climate security hotspots. So in simple term, a climate security hotspot is an area where climate stress, such as droughts, intersects with conflicts or insecurities, and in areas where communities have least capacity to cope. To build these hotspots, we overlaid different types of data. Droughts data, rainfall data, conflict data, and socioeconomic data sets, to obtain a map that really highlights the areas where all these features overlap. In our study, we identified over 152 hotspots, mainly across Somali, Oromia, and Afar regions. And interestingly, what we saw is that regions that experience the most climate security hotspots experience also the most out-migrations. In addition, areas that experience most hotspots were found to have migrants that were more likely to move within the region compared to outside the region. Thank you.
So my question goes to Sabira. What is the scale of migration that we are witnessing in the region in terms of numbers, and how significant is climate change as a driver of migration there?
Thank you, Kenza, and I'm very happy to be here with you today and really discussing what is an extremely important topic and an extremely exciting product that has just been launched by the Regional Data Hub. So in terms of numbers, I mean, the scale is definitely striking. And if we look at the data from March of this year, March 2025, the Eastern Horn of Africa region had 15.7 million internally displaced persons, with Ethiopia accounting for 1.9 million and Somalia 3.2 million people. And we know that Eastern Horn of Africa has really been consistently the African sub-region with the highest absolute numbers of IDPs due to natural disasters. So while conflict, of course, is a major driver of displacement, both historically and at present, what we're seeing is that climate shocks, such as the worst drought that we've seen in 40 years from 2020 to 2023, followed by El Nino-induced floods in 2024, have really significantly contributed to displacement. These events, of course, they disrupt livelihoods, particularly in agricultural dependent communities, and we know that most of these communities are dependent on agriculture, and so climate change is really a critical factor in mobility decisions. However, I did want to make one critical point, and that is that while the numbers are definitely high, there are countless others on the move, including those that move across borders, labor migrants, pastoralist communities, that move for so many different reasons, but they may not necessarily be captured as IDPs or migrants that are directly moving because of conflict and climate change drivers. So it's really important to understand that the numbers paint a picture, but they don't paint the whole picture. And we really need to, I think, take that into account and also look for other sources of data, such as case study research, look at our anecdotal information from our field operations, and ensure that all of these movements are also addressed and captured in the same way, and the responses really address both the climate change and the conflict side.
Thank you very much, Sabira, and thank you for bringing up the data as well as the impact that climate change has. So I'm going to go a little bit further on this particular topic, and I would like you to share with us how climate change and climate-related factors relate to other drivers of migration, for example, conflict or economic opportunity.
That's a great question. And I think one thing that we have always known, but something that has been, I think, increasingly captured also in research and conceptual frameworks, is that the decisions to migrate are complex and they're driven by many drivers, and they're often very context specific. I'm just recalling this Foresight report that was now published almost 15 years ago. And it presented this conceptual framework for climate change as a driver of migration. This is the first time that a report had looked at how climate change actually interacts with migration in such a detailed way. And so the conceptual framework really presented this visual that climate change actually interacts with other drivers, for example, economic, political, demographic, social drivers, and basically it amplifies existing vulnerabilities. So we know that climate change interacts with political drivers like conflict, and we know that climate change, of course, affects the resource base, which affects livelihoods, and this in turn contributes to migration. So in summary, what I'm trying to say is that when we have prolonged droughts, these reduce water and pasture availability, these fuel, in some contexts, resource-based conflicts, and this, in turn, also can contribute to displacement or migration. So the decision to move or displacement isn't necessarily a linear link to climate change, but climate change is an overall, an underlying driver that actually affects both economic opportunities, agricultural productivity, but also creates conditions for increased conflict. And this is something that we've seen very clearly in our data and analysis, and we've seen that when we look at really the reasons for migration within the Eastern Horn of Africa region, we've seen that migration emerges, particularly when you're looking within a specific location or within a country, that migration is often a result of the need for having immediate responses to climatic and socioeconomic stressors. We've seen that these patterns are often driven by acute needs such as access to water and basic services, family reunification, as well as livelihood preservation. But what we also see in our data is that when we're looking at the longer, or the further the movement is, migration beyond the Eastern Horn of Africa is largely driven by economic aspirations and opportunities, including, for example, access to labor markets and the potential for greater financial stability. So in summary, I think while the primary motivations for different types of movements may not necessarily reflect climate change as the main reason, it's always an underlying driver of movement within this region, irrespective of the specific context.
Thank you so much, Sabira, and thank you for making the link between migration, displacement, and climate change. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that, and I would like to know, and I would like you to share with our listeners, are there specific communities which are especially vulnerable to the impact of climate change?
Yes, definitely. Maybe I can shed specific light on a group of populations that's often not remembered or not talked about as much when we talk about vulnerability. But in this region, it's extremely important to remember that there are large agro-pastoralist communities that have for decades and more than that for the entire lives, as well as the lives of their descendants, have moved to find pasture and other land. And these agro-pastoralist communities are those in climate security hotspots, which are basically areas with recurrent droughts, limited resource management capacity, and we see that they're particularly at risk. Last month, we held a media workshop along with APAC and the Office of the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, and we listened to the stories of the media. This isn't necessarily hard data, but it's very important anecdotal information reporting directly from the field, which reflected on the fact that many of these pastoralist communities are now crossing over to new areas and pastures that often have already agricultural communities residing in them, which is now creating new conditions for conflict and resulting in tensions between the communities. So I think it's extremely important to also remember agro-pastoralist communities and that these zones often overlap with socio-political instability. Of course, it's important also just to remind ourselves that gender dynamics also matter. And of course, while we see that men are more likely to migrate for work and in context, for example, in Somalia, feel additional pressure to be able to provide for their families when climate change is eroding their livelihood base, women also face mobility constraints. They remain trapped, and this also can increase their exposure to climate and conflict stress. And the last group that it would be remiss of me not to mention is, of course, children on the move, and the fact that they face unique challenges. And this is something in terms of data and trends that we're seeing more and more, that displacement can actually separate children from caregivers. There's more children now moving along the eastern route than before. Many, of course, lack documentation, making it hard to access services. So children in general, in the context of migration, are vulnerable, but when it comes to climate change, also have this dual impact of not being able to receive information when it comes to early warning systems, or even able to benefit from climate change adaptation projects.
Thank you so much, Sabira, for these interesting insights and also for helping us shed light on the key findings of this report. One of the key findings of the study is that migration within the region often responds to immediate needs, with extra-regional migration, while extra-regional migration, is more linked to long-term economic and security deterioration. How did you arrive at this conclusion, and what does this mean in practice?
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you again. So to arrive to this conclusion, we did what we called a trend analysis. So basically, what we did was to plot migration data over time to identify trends and peaks of migration in the period of study that was between 2018 and 2024. Once we identified those migration peaks, we compared those peaks with general literature to identify whether some external events such as droughts or climatic stress vis-a-vis economic shocks or conflict had happened in the same period, and compared them with individual answers from migrants in our data set. So this comparison really allowed us to link what people were stating in the survey with what was happening on the ground. And clearly this helped us to have a better understanding on the migration dynamics going on in this region. So this approach shows us a clear pattern, especially for people that were moving within the region. Migration spiked during or just after droughts episodes, as I was telling you before, for example, between 2020 and 2023. During those peaks, people mention motivation such as access to water or food or basic services 2 to 3 more times more often compared to long-term averages. This, in our opinion, clearly suggests that these movements were short-term responses to this climate stress. In contrast, for people moving outside the region, migration really increased more progressively. was less peaks. It was a more progressive line, we can say, during the period of study, marking peaks during periods of economic declines or even after intercommunal clashes in Ethiopia. During those peaks, 90% of these people mention economic motivation for moving, alongside with some mentioning also conflict or persecution, but even environmental stress. So what this means in practice is that climate and conflict dynamics really affect households and mobility patterns. Even though individuals might not mention or recognize climate as a first driver, we can observe this through indirect channels, we can say. For example, accessing food and water.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you for giving us this very comprehensive picture of the findings, what they entail. So now we would like to look more into policy and practice. More specifically, how can climate, smart agriculture, and resource management reduce the pressures that drive migration in fragile ecosystems?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. This is a great question, as I think that everyone would agree that migration, especially in regions such as East and Horn of Africa, can be driven by failing livelihoods and pressure over resources, alongside lack of opportunities. And this is exacerbated by land degradation and ongoing climate stress. Practices such as climate-smart agriculture or sustainable resource management can really help to reduce this pressure at their roots. In Ethiopia, for example, practices such as soil and water conservation, terracing, and drought-tolerant crops have shown good results in decreasing this kind of pressure, stabilizing livelihood, and helping in restoring the environment. Furthermore, similarly to pastoralist communities, rangelands and watershed management has helped pastoralist communities to maintain grazing and water access even during harsh conditions and seasons. So I would say that this kind of practices, these community-based practices, really foster cooperation instead of competition. Thus, in fragile ecosystems like this one that I've been mentioning, this measure can really strengthen resilience, lowering tension and support livelihood.
Oh, very, very interesting way of looking at these questions from our policy and practice point of view. On this particular point, it would be interesting to share with our listeners how mobility governance frameworks can, so these mobility governance frameworks such as Aggad's protocols on free movement and transhumance, how they can be strengthened to better support communities facing climate and conflict stress.
Thanks for this question, Kenza. And again, this is an excellent question because the Aggad region does have a range of protocols that are really critical when we're looking at this nexus of climate change, security, and migration. So there is, of course, the Aggad protocol on free movement. There's also the Aggad protocol on transhumance. But the challenge is that these aren't effectively operationalized. So in terms of how can we strengthen them to actually support communities, it's really important to look at how we can actually support their implementation. The first or one of the practical steps that really needs to be taken is firstly looking at the sensitization of local authorities on particularly, that are located across, at the border, in bordering areas, to really look at supporting them to understand the content of these protocols and allowing them and enabling them to enforce the key aspects under these protocols. It's really important to assess the capacity of these frontline duty bearers, looking at border management. It's important to also look at how to support them to better manage conflict, supporting mobility-related community support as well. And another aspect that's also critical is looking at how we can monitor and track movements, particularly transhumance movements, and ensure that there is enough data on transhumance to be able to inform local level officials, particularly in cases where this is likely to lead to conflict. So one of the good practices we have is the transhumance tracking tool. And there has been some level of discussion with a C1, which is the conflict early warning mechanism, and looking at how we can integrate C1, the TTT into the C1 to really monitor cross-border transhumance in, conflict-affected areas, for example, the Mandera cluster. We can also look at developing or supporting governments to actually develop and sign bilateral and multilateral agreements for implementation. And of course, within this, it's important to look not only at how they implement the protocol, but ensure that they have a climate-sensitive approach to doing so. So I think those are some tangible examples, but the first step is really looking at how we can put these into practice.
If you could leave policymakers at COP30 with one key message from this research, what would it be?
So if I may take the liberty of giving 3 key messages, the first is that it's very critical for the next COP and for the UNFCCC negotiations in general to specifically look at how climate change is an exacerbating factor when it comes to conflict, to look at this nexus of climate change and conflict, and also to look at how this can be considered more when it comes to climate financing. We've seen that countries that receive the least climate financing are the countries that are the most fragile, and that is particularly an issue that needs to be addressed. The second point would be really looking at continuing this advocacy for peace, promoting climate change adaptation. And this means really when peace-building programs are implemented or when climate change adaptation programs are implemented on the ground, we really need to mainstream this idea of the humanitarian development and peace nexus. So explicitly integrating climate change and climate-sensitive approaches into peace-building approaches, and vice versa, looking at having peace-promoting activities within climate change programmings. And then the last point, and this speaks to, of course, the essence of the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment, Climate Change, is really to ensure that policymakers recognize that within this discussion on climate change and security, that migration should be recognized not just as a crisis, but really as an adaptive strategy, and that policy should really look at enabling safe, dignified movement that can transform vulnerability into resilience.
If I have to leave one message to policymakers, I would say that mobility, especially in regions such as the Eastern Horn of Africa, is really part of life and is a fundamental mean of adaptation. So I really believe that when well managed, migration can protect lives, can sustain livelihoods, and strengthen resilience in face of climate stress. So rather than trying to stop it, I would say that policymakers should focus on making it safer, more planned and supported through investment protection and regional cooperation. So in short, migration should be really seen as an adaptation in motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabira, and thank you, Victor, for being here with us today. And listeners, I hope that you were able to enjoy this podcast. Stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.